Chapter 25. A Day in the Life of a Mobster. Don't worry, GI, we don't have any actual files on you at our precinct, so we don't have anything to share. Everyone here that knows you has their lips sealed. They know better than to rat you out because they know they'd be going down right after, Detective Alvarado said. I can't say the same for any of the other stations, though. Ransom leaned against the police car and watched across the street where a group of kids was playing basketball. Their laughter was muffled by the hundreds of engines passing by on the street between them. The boys looked happy, carefree. He envied them in their ignorance. He wished he hadn't been born into this life with the whole weight of the last 60 years of his corrupt family business on his shoulders. But he didn't think he had another choice. That was another reason he had to stay away from Lena. He didn't deserve her, but even if he was selfish enough to try and make her his own, he didn't want her to have to live in a life like this. This life only had one escape: death. What about the girl, though? You sure she didn't say anything? Ransom nodded his head. I'm sure. The detective raised an eyebrow and nudged Ransom with his elbow. You sound pretty confident. Have you gained another trustworthy associate? Have you gained a partner? Ransom shrugged away from the detective and clenched his teeth. Was it selfish of him to wish that he had? Because part of him did. But that little part didn't matter when the majority of him, his reason, knew better. No. I've got nothing to do with her, he said coldly. Detective Alvarado seemed skeptical. He narrowed his eyes and peered up at his friend's face. Really? Because you seem kinda weird about this. I'm not weird. I'm normal. The detective scoffed. You've never been normal, but this is a different kind of weird. Are you by chance disappointed? It was scary having a friend that could read him so well, but as long as he denied it, he hoped that the detective would drop it. Like I said, I'm normal. Before the detective could press him any more on the subject, Ransom decided he'd better leave. Right on time, the detective got a call that he was needed back at the station. Ransom used that chance to dip out without even saying goodbye. It was usually for the best that way. Goodbyes were too formal. Ransom had a full day ahead of him anyway, and after he'd spent the entire morning talking with Detective Alvarado about the situation with the Northeast Division breathing down the Giudice's necks, all of a sudden, he was starting to fall behind on his daily duties. He had to stop by Alron's Supermarket Plus and Reno's underground gambling ring, which was hidden in the basement of the tailor's shop, to pick up the weekly collection. Stopping by the supermarket was quick and easy. All he had to do was go in and buy a pack of Perez Carrillo Bellicoso cigars for his father, and a pack of winter mint gum for himself, and Jeffrey Alron, the owner, would hand him his payment. He drove across town and hopped out of the car at the tailor's shop, popping a new stick of gum in his mouth. He'd never picked up smoking or any other drugs, and he was often teased for it. The teasing didn't go far, however, since he was the boss, and he could make a grown man pez his pants with just one murderous look. It was a handy skill to have. You're driving the Stang today, I see, Brennan said, approaching him. This was Brennan's side of town. He was one of Ransom's most trusted capos, and the one who kept him up to date with the latest gossip and rumors. Ransom looked back at his bronze and black 1972 Ford Mustang Mach 1. It was his errand car, while his truck was his incognito/civilian car. His father had gifted him the newly restored Mustang for his 18th birthday, the same year his brother was killed, and it quickly became his most prized possession for the memories he created in it. For him, it stood as the last symbol of his complete family, the last time they were all happy together. Yeah, Ransom said, patting Brennan on the shoulder as he came up to him. It's errand day. Gotta show her off. And here I was hoping you were just coming to see me because you missed me, Brennan said with his bottom lip jutting out. How could I miss you when I see you at least 3 times a week? Most people think 3 times a week is not enough time to see their best friend. Ransom chuckled and opened the door to the tailor's shop. Brennan followed him inside. I think if you desire to see someone more than 3 times a week, it probably means you're in love with them. Are you in love with me, Brennan? Brennan batted his eyelashes. How could I not be when you have such a killer smile? When you're so personable and warm-hearted. Ransom shoved his buddy into the doorjamb and shut him up before he could say another sarcastic thing. Brennan let go of his joke and started filling him in on the happenings of the previous 2 days. The gambling ring hit it big the night before. Danny and Vanessa were broken up again, and Jerry picked up his nose problem again. It was a whole lot of the same. He collected the gambling ring money from Brennan as well as the extortion money from the tailor. Ransom left a bit of his cut for the tailor since he was going above and beyond to let them keep running their gambling gig there despite the increasing dangers. You got the money from Wallace Avenue? Ransom asked Brennan. Brennan shook his head. He didn't pay up. I already got Reggie on it. He'll be smashing some kneecaps tonight. Don't worry, you'll get your money soon, man. Ransom wanted to tell him that he didn't care. All he really cared about was what Lena was doing. He wondered if she was thinking of him. She wondered if she regretted asking him to stay for drinks, even when he didn't end up staying. Perhaps he should have. No. He had to keep reminding himself it was for the best. Good, Ransom said flatly. Do what you gotta do. I'd rather not get my hands dirty. After he finished up his business at the tailor's, Ransom went back home. It was already getting dark, and he was feeling heavy with the day's work. It was only going to get worse when his father finally told him to step up and take over as the boss. He was not looking forward to it. Hey, Pops, Ransom said, opening the heavy door to his father's office. The room was dark, lit up only by the light streaming in from the attached bedroom. Brought your cut and your cigars. He strode over to his father's desk, which was empty like usual, and dropped the envelope of money on top of the desktop calendar. It still said January. He ripped off the top 3 sheets so that the proper month was showing. He knocked the empty bottle of vermouth into the trash can. Ransom flipped on the lamp in the corner of the desk, and his father flinched and sat up on the little couch nearby that sat under the window that overlooked the front of the house. Ah, my boy, his father said with a grunt as he hefted himself up. It's good to see you. Ransom could tell by his tired, raspy voice that he'd been asleep for quite a while, probably passed out again from drinking too much. Ransom wished he could tell his father that it was good to see him too, but he'd promised never to lie to him. Chapter 26. Ripping off the Band-Aid. A thick envelope landed on Lena's desk with a sharp smack. She looked over her shoulder at Ethan Green, the CEO of her company, Green Consulting Group. He wasn't a terrible boss, but he did tend to be bossy, especially after taking over the business after his father retired. I need these back by the end of the day, Morris, he said flatly. And please respond to your emails in a timely manner while you are here. I know you get the privilege of dropping the business from your mind as soon as you walk away from the office, but while you're here I need you to be present. Yes, sir, Lena said with her office lady smile. She was usually on top of her work no matter what, but her mind had been wandering to thoughts about Ransom, which led to concerns about Brian, which led to panicked musings about ending their relationship. She knew she had to do it soon. Ever since her chat with Adrian, she was quiet, and Brian had started taking note of it. For the last couple of nights, he had pestered her about what was wrong, and she had managed to convince him that she was fine and just tired. But she could only lie for so long. Lena prided herself on being a quick and efficient worker, and usually she was recognized as such, so if her boss was telling her to be present, then she really needed to kick it into gear. She opened the folder for a new dating app called The Right Stuff, and spread the reports out on her desk. For startups like that, she needed to ensure that she offered the best advice on operating their products and services, and help them work out insurance coverage, as well as offering them a variety of strategic debt management procedures. After completing that and some expense reports for another company, it was after 5 o'clock, and her workday had finally ended. As she walked over to the stairs, she passed Ethan Green's office. He was still there with his glasses hanging off the tip of his nose as he clacked away on his computer. He was a hard worker, there was no doubt about that. She wished she didn't like him, but it was obvious he was under a lot of pressure taking over his father's company. She sympathized with him. I'll see you Monday, she said through his open door. Bright and early, he replied as usual. When she got home, she only had about 15 minutes to herself before Brian came over. It was usual for him to arrive early on Friday nights to make dinner. It was just something he had sort of started doing before she even realized it. She supposed it wouldn't hurt if it was something he liked to do. It was one less meal she had to make for herself. Hello, dear, Brian said sweetly as he walked through the door. He didn't even knock anymore. It kind of annoyed her, but what was she going to do? She couldn't tell the man she was supposed to eventually share a home with that she wanted him to start knocking even when she was expecting him, could she? She wasn't sure what the protocol was there. Lena nodded a hello and flipped her head back to the TV where she was pretending to watch the news. She felt it in her bones. Tonight was the night that she had to break up with him. She just wasn't sure when to do it. Before supper? After? With her chest feeling like a load of rocks, she willed herself off of the couch and padded into the kitchen where Brian was already starting the chicken. Ugh, not chicken again. Was that the only thing he knew how to make? Lena stood awkwardly far away from him in the center of the kitchen. How was a conversation like this supposed to go? Was it better to ease into it or rip off the Band-Aid? Do you want to help me out this time? Brian asked over his shoulder. He was chopping some onions. Maybe she would tell him after he put down the knife. Oh, Lena said. She was caught off guard, not expecting him to say anything to her yet. What if I finish chopping the stuff? Nah, that's okay, Brian said. I know you don't like chopping onions because it stings your eyes. I'll finish this. You can put the pasta in the water. It should be boiling. Why did this man have to be so attentive? He really didn't deserve to be let go all of a sudden like this. Her stomach flopped and twisted angrily as she thought about what she was going to say. Even though she didn't love Brian, she didn't want to hurt him. She played it tough most of the time, but she wasn't a naturally mean person. She appeared cold on the outside, and she let people believe it, but she knew she was a people pleaser when it came to the people closest to her. Unfortunately, that included Brian by default. Lena grabbed the box of pasta and opened it, then she peeked over at Brian at the sink. Just as she started pouring the pasta in, she noticed that he finished chopping up the onions and laid the knife down in the bottom of the sink. Now, she thought, now or never. Actually, she said, spinning around and losing a couple of pieces of pasta to the floor. She ignored them and forced herself to say the words. I need to say something. What's that? Brian asked. He was grinning, apparently finding the situation a bit funny. This poor man, Lena thought. She cleared her throat and put the box of pasta on the counter. I think we should break up, she said. Brian stared at her, his smile withering. What did you say? I think I misheard you. You didn't, Lena said confidently. We need to break up. Brian let out a hefty scoff and rubbed his hands over his face. He winced when the juice of the onions got in his eye. Mitt, he yelled.
Lena flinched.
She'd never heard him yell before. He was always so calm and respectful. She wasn't sure what to do as he went over to the sink and rinsed out his eye. He patted it dry and spun around, his face contorted with angry confusion. Are you sure you don't want to talk about this? Brian asked, stepping towards her. I think we should talk about this. His eyes were flat and scarily dark. His pupils seemed more pinpoint than they should have been. I'm sure, she said, determined to hold her ground. I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's not right of me to string you along anymore. String me along? Brian laughed. Is that what you call getting engaged to me and promising to marry me after we've been together for 4 years? What about all of those times you said you loved me? Lena tightened her hands into fists, balling up her energy to hold fast. I'm sorry, but I don't love you. The sinews of Brian's jaw muscles began to flex. His nostrils began to flare. Are you f***ing kidding me? Lena turned her face away, yearning to get away from the volume of his voice. She closed her eyes. She didn't know it was going to feel like this. It was kind of scary. Were all breakups like that? I'm sorry, but that's the truth, Lena stated, her voice not quite as strong as she'd hoped it would come out. I can't marry you. Haven't you noticed that I haven't even been wearing the engagement ring?
No.
We need to talk about this, Brian said, grabbing Lena's wrist and dragging her into the living room. She fought to pull her arm away, but his grip was stronger than she imagined. He pushed her towards the couch and she collapsed onto it. What the hell? She said, wiping her hair off of her face. This didn't feel right. He'd never been physical with her before. Sure, sometimes he got a little handsy even when she told him she wasn't in the mood for that kind of thing, but he'd never grabbed her like that before. She massaged her wrists, suddenly thinking about the way it felt when she'd been tied to the chair in Ransom's basement. You can't leave me, he yelled. He was pacing back and forth across the living room now, combing his hands through his hair and even pulling some of it out. I've spent too much time with you with the promise of marriage for you to just toss me aside like this. Lena gritted her teeth. What was she going to have to say to him to get him to accept this? Brian, I just don't. Shut up, he yelled. Shut up. Lena leaned back onto the couch, her mouth snapping shut in surprise. Behind Brian, a commercial about fried chicken was playing an obnoxious song. Brian was almost hyperventilating now, clearly panicking. She was going to have to calm him down first in order to finish this conversation. Brian, she said quietly, trying to speak softly yet firmly. She began to rise slowly from the couch. It felt like she was approaching a wild puppy. Let's just talk then, Anne. I said shut up. Brian screamed. He spun around and grabbed the TV, ripping it off of the TV stand and slamming it onto the floor. He glared at her, his eyes wild and his chest heaving with each exaggerated breath. Chapter 27. I'm glad I was here. Get out, Lena said, surprising herself. Her heart was racing now, and the hairs on her arm were standing rigid. You can't make me leave, Brian seethed. You're my fiancé. What's mine is yours, remember?
No. Lena yelled.
She clasped her hands tightly and closed her eyes. The situation would only get worse if she got angry too. She needed to keep a level head. No, she repeated firmly. I'm not. Not anymore. Brian took a step toward her, but Lena put her hand up and stepped back. She didn't have anywhere to go, her back to the couch, which was right in front of the big bay window, and him standing before her. Don't come any closer. I'm not going to talk to you when you're like this, she said. I know what I said came as a shock, but I won't let you. Why are you doing this? Brian asked. His volume had decreased, but his tone was still edgy and rough. What did I do to deserve this?
Lena gulped.
She could feel her face starting to get hot with fear and embarrassment for him and her both. You didn't do anything, she stated. I just don't want this. Brian began laughing. It was a sick wry sound. It made her uncomfortable. Fine, he said after a moment. But I hope you know if you're really ending this, your perfect life will be far from perfect. I'm everything you ever needed to get mommy and daddy's approval. That's gone as soon as I am. Ouch, that was a home run hit. I don't care, Lena said. I don't need it. Brian didn't like the sound of that. In one last flare of his temper tantrum, he went over to Lena's favorite bookshelf and shoved it over onto the floor. He cursed her and grabbed hold of the curtains behind the couch and yanked them off of the wall. He stormed past her, bumping her into the wall on the way to the foyer, where he grabbed the little vintage table by the front door and flung it down the hall. Lena watched, frozen and bewildered, as Brian jerked open the door, got into his car and peeled out of the driveway. As soon as his headlights were gone, Lena sank onto the floor. That was not at all how she thought that would go. That was so much scarier than she could have imagined or ever expected. She didn't even notice that her body was trembling, or that she was crying until her tears fell onto her arms. Ransom watched as Lena's fiancé stormed through the house. He had told himself that he wasn't going to watch Lena anymore, but he found himself back at her house. He had just pulled up to check on her when he saw the harsh movement in the windows. He watched closely with his hand on the door handle, his muscles tense and itching to jump out of the car and kick that guy's ass. But he had to restrain himself from storming into her house and confronting Brian. As a mafia man who had to stay out of the police system, he knew better. Though the fiancé never laid a hand on Lena, his pomp and ape-like show of power were too much. What a child, he thought. As soon as Ransom saw him push past Lena and bump her into the wall, he was out of his car and ready to risk it all to teach that guy some manners. Luckily for him, though, he fled to his car and sped away before Ransom could get to him. Ransom was standing at the end of Lena's driveway, her front door open. He could see items scattered all across the floor of the foyer. He peeked through the window and didn't see her. Was she okay? Ransom was suddenly worried that that guy might have hurt her before he arrived. He ran into the house and into the living room where he had last seen Lena standing. She was sitting in the middle of the floor, her toppled-over bookshelf and a pile of books lying all across the floor. He spotted the TV smashed on the hardwood and the curtains were torn down. Lena was sitting there so quietly and still, staring down into her lap. She didn't even seem to notice that he'd walked in. He approached her slowly, kneeling down onto the floor and peeking around her. Lena, he whispered. She flinched and jumped backwards. He felt bad for frightening her, but as soon as he saw the tears streaming down her face, he was flooded with the desire to hold her. She wiped at her eyes and blinked them fiercely, trying so hard to hide her pain. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice cracking. Lena, are you okay? Ransom asked, reaching out and touching her wrist lightly. Are you hurt? She nodded to tell him she was fine, but he could see another wave of tears trying to bust through. Her lip quivered. It's okay if you're not, he said. With that, Lena's face crumbled, and she brought her hands to her face to hide. She sobbed into her palms, her whole body shaking. Before he even knew what he was doing, Ransom slid over to her and pulled her into his arms. He let her cry it out, rubbing her back and soaking the shoulder of his shirt with tears spent on that lame shat of a fiancé. Lena couldn't remember the last time she was hugged. Maybe family pictures. It felt nice, but once her tank of tears was running low, and she started to calm down, she wasn't sure what to do. She pulled away from Ransom, his hand sliding off of her back and into his lap. She didn't want to look at his face. Why was he even there? Why then? And she sure as hell didn't want him to see her face. She swiped at the wet mess under her eyes, sure that her mascara had left horrible ugly streaks of black down her cheeks. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean. Don't, Ransom said, stopping her. She peeked up at him, confused. Don't what? She wondered. Ransom's face was tense, his eyebrows pinching together and causing a taut wrinkle in between them. "Don't apologize," he explained. "I don't know exactly what happened here, but I'm sure you have nothing to apologize for." Lena's chest squeezed with embarrassment. If she just approached the topic differently, maybe Brian wouldn't have gotten so defensive so quickly. If she had eased into it instead, then maybe he wouldn't have been so surprised. She looked around the room. He had destroyed so many of her things. Even though she didn't do it, that was embarrassing too. "Are you okay?" Ransom asked her again, searching what he could see of her half-covered face. What was she supposed to say? She was dandy? She wasn't. She was stunned, scared, uncomfortable, ashamed. It was one thing for her to go through that on her own, but now Ransom was there to witness this complicated ugliness. That made it worse. "What are you even doing here?" she asked coldly. Ransom was unfazed by the bite in her words. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." "No, why are you here? I thought you were never going to come around again." She knew it wasn't the time for guilt-tripping, but the words were out before she even realized she was thinking them. Ransom sighed, never taking his eyes off of her face. "I wasn't supposed to be," he said, reaching up to touch her chin. "But I'm glad I was." At the touch of his warm hand on her skin, Lena's trembling muscles were overpowered by the sudden onset of tachycardia. Her face went hot, and she was tempted to turn away. He made her feel so shy. Ransom didn't let her. He wiped her tears away gently with his thumb and kept her facing towards him. His eyes went soft, but the crease between his eyebrows was still there. He touched her so gingerly, looked at her so sweetly. She let herself look over his face, just inches from hers. She had never noticed the small scar on the left corner of the bottom of his lip before. "What a terrible time to wish someone would kiss you," she scolded herself. Chapter 28. Crashed bookshelves and damaged drywall. The smell of charred meat began to waft in from the kitchen. Ransom tried ignoring the smell because he didn't want a reason to look away from Lena. Her beautiful green eyes had lightened with her crying, and as he studied them closer, he noticed flecks of reddish-brown in them that were similar to her hair color. He'd been waiting for the moment he'd get to touch her face like this, and he didn't want it to end so soon. On top of that, by the way she kept glancing down at his lips, he could tell her mind was in the same realm as his. If only she just leaned forward an inch or two, then he'd be able to split the distance and finally kiss her. But just as Ransom thought she was about to make the move, instead Lena turned her head away. "Oh no," she said. "The stove. I guess Brian left it on." She began to stand, and Ransom helped her up but pressed her shoulder gently to keep her in place. "I'll take care of it." He jogged into the kitchen and removed the skillet and the boiling pot of water from the hot stove and turned it off. He came back to witness Lena kneeling down, piling some of her books together. Her mind seemed to be somewhere else as she stacked the books and used her hand to sweep some loose dirt from a plant that had crashed onto the ground. She reached to pick up a piece of the plant's broken ceramic pot. "Let me help you," he said, bending down and scooping up the pieces. He didn't want her to cut her fingers. Lena looked at him, shocked. He knew she was surprised to see him earlier, and after that spontaneous tender moment between them, maybe she was feeling a bit dazed. Ransom didn't wait for her answer. He put the pieces on the coffee table and then hefted the bookcase upright. "It's got a pretty good dent in it here on the side," he said. He just wanted her to speak so he knew that she was okay. Lena stepped around to look at it. Her shoulder brushed his shoulder, and Ransom felt a spike of adrenaline shoot through his body. He gave himself a mental slap on the hand and took a step back. She had just had a fight with her fiancé. He wondered if that happened a lot. He wondered if he had those kinds of tantrums often or if he stormed off like that before. Or if that was the first time, then did that mean something big happened? Had she broken up with him? Ransom felt so selfish as those questions swirled around in his head. "Listen," Ransom began to say, now even sure what words were about to come out of his mouth. "You don't deserve to be with a guy like that. He should be cherishing you." "Thanks for helping me out with that," Lena said, ignoring him. She began to stick books on the shelf haphazardly. It didn't seem like her to do that. He imagined she kept things tidy and in order. "Lena," he said, "are you sure you're okay? I don't know what exactly happened, and it's not my business, but you don't have to." "I ended it," she said flatly. Ransom's heart felt like it stopped. "Ended it?" he asked, a sense of hope bubbling up in his chest.
No.
He wasn't supposed to be thinking these things. He shouldn't have even been interacting with her. He was supposed to be letting her live her life. Her newly single life. "I'm sorry to hear that," he lied. He peeked over at her, Her lips pressed in a flat line and her eyes rimmed with red. Lena shoved another couple of books on one of the shelves, and her hand fell limp and slapped against her thigh. She huffed and shrugged. "It's okay," she said. Ransom gritted his teeth together. He hated that he was hopeful in hearing about her breakup when she was obviously upset. He wanted to soothe her distress somehow, but it didn't feel like his place. He was still practically a stranger that knew a lot about her and occasionally watched her. Oh God, he thought. I'm her freaking stalker. I'm sorry again for showing up out of the blue, he said. He needed to get out of there. This situation was starting to feel all kinds of wrong. Why did it have to be like this between them? He just wanted to have met her at a coffee shop or at the local supermarket. Or if he just asked her name when he saw her on the street that night, things might have gone differently. I'm glad you did, she spoke softly. I was starting to think I'd never see you again. You wanted to see me? He muttered in disbelief. Lena pinched her eyebrows together and shook her head. Did that mean she didn't want to see him? Was he causing her distress? Lena suddenly looked Ransom right in the eye. It caught him off guard how solid and unwavering her gaze was after she'd just been so vulnerable. I've been wondering about you, she said. Ransom blinked in astonishment. Was she trying to tell him something? He wished she'd be more specific. Feeling awkward for probably the first time in his life, Ransom looked around the room. He noted the torn curtains. The hardware attached to the wall had been ripped off, and now the sheetrock was damaged. If it's okay with you, I'll come back tomorrow and fix that, he said, pointing behind her at the mess. He needed an excuse to see her again. Lena didn't turn around to see what he was talking about. Don't, she said. Ransom dropped his hand. Don't what? Don't come tomorrow. I can't see you then. Ransom put his hands on his hips and shifted nervously. Just what the heck was going on? Did he say the wrong thing? What do you mean? Did I do something to upset you? He tried to hide the panic that was edging on his tongue. The last thing he wanted to do was make Lena uncomfortable. Perhaps he should have just watched the rest of the argument from afar and just made sure that she was okay. She was probably stunned from that, and then freaked out even more when he showed up in her house suddenly.
No.
Not at all. I'm really glad you were here, she said. I just need some time to straighten out my mind, and I find you distracting. Ransom sighed with relief, and then her words hit him. What did that mean? He was a distraction? He wanted to ask for clarification because the possibility of her finding him a distraction for the same reason he found it impossible to ignore her had him on edge. He knew he liked her. He couldn't lie to himself about that. But he shouldn't entertain the idea of being with her, especially so soon after a major breakup, and especially because of his particular line of work. He felt conflicted, to say the least. He wanted her when he shouldn't. She made him feel all the right kinds of weak. Okay, he said, not wanting to push her. He figured it would be best to give her her space for real this time. Just, I'll leave you alone.
No worries.
Ransom began to back out of the room, but Lena caught the hem of his shirt. Just give me some time, she said, looking down at the floor. A week? No, 2. Give me 2 weeks. He didn't know his heart could beat so fast. It felt like it could fly straight out of his chest at any moment. This was a dangerous kind of feeling, he knew, but he was thrilled by it. He wasn't sure what he would be waiting for, what she would be doing during those 2 weeks, but if it meant getting to see her again, then he would wait however long she wanted. Okay, he said. It was his turn to be dazed now. He didn't want to put any pressure on her, whatever she was thinking. He needed to confirm that he wasn't going to leave her, but that he wasn't expecting anything, even though he was hoping for a lot. I'll come back in 2 weeks to fix the drywall. Chapter 29. It's going to be good. The phone rang only twice before her father answered. Even though she had purposefully dialed the number, she was surprised to hear his voice on the other line. It had already been a week since Lena broke up with Brian. Brian had come back to the house 2 days later and apologized for his behavior, but she wouldn't let him inside. She had told him that she was sorry if he felt like she wasted his time, but that in a few weeks he would realize he was better off without her. She told him that he deserved to be in a more loving relationship, and that he'd make someone else very happy someday. It was all of the stuff she'd heard in romantic movies and things Adrian had said about her random flings, but it was the truth. She felt bad for him. She felt guilty for using him for so long. But she was ready to move on and finally figure out what she wanted from her life. Her brief stay with Ransom those few short weeks ago had been nagging her for more reasons than one. Obviously she was into Ransom, and she wanted to get to know him. She knew it was crazy to be attracted to someone who was probably most definitely in the mafia, but the way he'd made her feel each time they were together. She would be leaving so much up in the air if she didn't follow her gut and see what all of that was about, and now she would be able to do that with a clean conscience. But other than Ransom, Lena realized after returning home that she wasn't living her full life. Her mother and father were semi-estranged from her, and even though she was doing well at work, she had made that her whole life. She wanted to try something imperfect. Maybe that was all she needed in order to finally feel something other than bland fulfillment of her family's and co-workers' platitudes.
Lena.
I wasn't expecting to hear from you, her father said. Oh, sorry to surprise you like this, she said. She felt like she was always apologizing to them.
No.
It's great to hear from you, honey, he replied. He sounded sincere. Her mother must not have been in the room, though I am a little surprised. You don't usually call out of the blue like this unless something has happened. Lena swallowed the lump in her throat. Is Mom around? She's in the middle of her Peloton routine. She should be done soon. Maybe it's better to tell you first anyway, Lena said. That was part of the reason she had called her father anyway. He tended to be more open-minded and patient with her. Her mother usually just jumped right into judgment and criticism. Please do, her father said. You're starting to worry me. Lena took a deep breath and spit it all out at once. I broke up with Brian. Before her father had time to respond, she spilled her guts about not really loving him and wanting to find real happiness. She even shed a couple of tears in the process. Oh, Lena, her father said sadly. I know it's been tough for you. I'm sorry you've been holding on to those feelings for so long. I'm glad you're doing what's best for you.
Lena smiled.
Her lungs swelled with fresh air and validation as she breathed in her father's message. But she was sure her mother wouldn't respond the same way. Do you think you could tell Mom for me? Please. I don't think I'm ready to hear all of her judgment yet. Her father chuckled sadly and told her he would. After a couple more minutes, they hung up, and Lena decided she wanted to take a hot bath to relax. She just stepped into the bathroom when her phone buzzed with a text message from her mother. It read, "Don't forget to return your wedding dress and cancel the event center. You might still be able to get your deposit back." That stung. There was no apology, no sympathizing message, not even any harsh criticisms. But the message had said it all. This was just one of those things Lena failed to do. Until it was a done deal, it was no deal at all. What did she expect? She needed to turn to someone she could really open up to. Someone who genuinely wanted to hear about her problems and help her out. I'm coming back to yoga on Monday, she muttered aloud as she typed a message to Adrian. But let's catch up over coffee. Tomorrow? Usual time. Moments later, Adrian replied with 2 thumbs-up emojis and a bright, red throbbing heart. Brian was obviously and understandably upset, but I haven't heard anything from him since, Lena told Adrian. Adrian was swirling her straw in her glass, mixing the ice and the light coffee together. She had done a good job of holding back any obnoxious comments, though when Lena told her about how Brian had trashed her place before he left, Adrian had muttered something about small decay energy. And I told my parents the day before yesterday, so there's that, too. Adrian nodded. She slid her glass away from her and leaned across the table to hold Lena's hands. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't a common thing for Adrian to do. She knew how Lena felt about physical contact and personal space. You've done a great and terrifying thing, Adrian said in her wise yogi voice. That took a lot of bravery. And I'm so proud of you for making these big decisions for yourself despite the inevitable criticism you'll face from your mother. Even though she sometimes sounded a bit hammed up, Lena appreciated Adrian's validation talks. She was truly a good friend. Lena was glad she had her. It's probably too soon, and I'm sorry if this upsets you, but I have to ask. Is this about that mysterious guy you told me about? Adrian asked.
Lena flinched.
She had been careful not to mention Ransom at all. She knew what it would look like if she mentioned that she'd seen him again, and that he was there right after the drama with Brian. Even though Lena was her cool, free-spirited, encouraging friend, Lena was still afraid that she would think differently of her if she knew the whole truth. No, Lena said. Not really. I mean, I can't deny that he awakened something in me, but I don't expect anything to come of him. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the total truth. The whole situation with Ransom was a gray area topic that she didn't really know how to approach. Adrian narrowed her eyes slightly but didn't ask any more questions. Well, as long as you're not doing anything you'll regret. I mean, I think leaving Brian was good. And I hope you find a great guy that you can really love later on down the line. But I just want you to be careful not to rush into anything.
Lena nodded.
Of course. I don't want to do that either. I'm just going to let things happen naturally. As Lena and Adrian left the coffee cafe, Lena noticed that she had a bit of pep back in her step. She was feeling better, lighter. She noticed little things like the cardinals in the trees and the pigeons on the sidewalk. She noticed the way the April sun felt on her face and the way people nodded politely as they passed her on the sidewalk. This was good, she told herself. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but whatever it was going to be good.
Chapitre 30, en informelle occasion.
The 2 longest weeks of Ransom's life were the 2 weeks that Lena had asked him to give her some space, so she could sort out her mind. Ironically, every day that she was sorting out her stuff, he was becoming antsier and antsier to see her again. Keeping away from her before then was difficult, but he had managed because she was engaged, and she was just an innocent bystander who got wrapped up in his world. But now there was definitely something brewing between him and her. It scared him as much as it exhilarated him, which seemed dangerous. Ransom wasn't the type of guy to just fall for any girl he came across. In fact, he'd hardly had a single girlfriend his whole life. In his younger years, he'd messed around with a girl here or there, but it was never anything serious. But after his father began to neglect his duties, Ransom took on the word and began to lead a serious life. That was all to say that his life had become so centered on running the Giudice Mafia that he didn't have time for fun things. Lena was different though. He'd known that the moment he saw her. Upon his first glance at her scowling face, it seemed like she was a miserable soul who was displeased by nearly everything. But when she met his eyes, he could see there was a whole hidden person behind them yearning to come out. Ransom wanted to meet that person. He wanted to meet every version of her. He wanted to know everything, all of her quirks, all of her secrets, all of her desires. When his 2-week wait time was finally over, he was wound up with his own desires, his own conflicted feelings, and so many questions he didn't even know where to begin. He was so confident in the beginning when he met her. He was able to flirt with her and tease her offhandedly, but things were starting to get serious now. He wasn't sure how to deal with that. He gripped the tool bag in his hands. Inside of it was a hidden bottle of champagne, the good stuff that they got from the docks. He hoped she'd ask him to stay after he'd done what he promised to do. The doorbell sounded quietly inside, and Ransom heard Lena's bare feet smacking across the floor. She got to the door quickly but paused for a little too long before opening the door. He smiled as he imagined her nervously combing her fingers through her hair or straightening up her blouse. When Lena opened the door, she was wearing a pair of casual jeans with holes in them and a plain black button-up blouse. Her hair was up in a high messy bun, and her makeup was minimal. It was a more casual look than he'd seen her wear when she was going to work, but it wasn't yoga class attire. He wondered if this was who he was. Classic, a little distressed. Buona sera, he said. He lifted his tool bag. I came to work. I thought it was Kyo. That's only for informal occasions, he said, smiling at her. He couldn't hold it back. Just seeing her made his skin feel charged up with electricity. You know, for when you're close to someone. She frowned at him. Is this a formal occasion? You tell me, Ransom said, stepping past her and into the house. He went through the foyer and rounded into her living room. He could feel her right behind him. He peeked back and saw that her arms were crossed over her chest. She looked serious, like she was thinking about how to respond. He got right to work while Lena stood closely behind him watching, thinking. In her silence he began to feel a bit nervous. She told him to come back, but now she was being so quiet. He'd given her a chance to tell him what she wanted out of this visit, and she'd chosen silence. So it's more about the person than the occasion then, Lena said as Ransom swiped the spackle over the holes in the wall. He finished up and turned around to look at her. Is that a question? Lena shook her head no. He could tell she was holding back from saying something. He grinned at her, thinking maybe she just needed a little push to say whatever was on her mind. He put his stuff in his bag and walked over to her. She was standing where she had been the whole time, in the middle of the living room. She unfolded her arms from her chest and put them at her side. He stood close to her, the excited prickles under his skin shooting through his fingertips, desiring to touch her. He thought this wasn't the time to be safe, but he wanted to give her enough space to do what she wanted. Lena's pupils dilated as Ransom brushed her wrist with his fingertips. She opened her palm to him, and he traced the inner parts of her fingers. Her skin was warm. He stood closer, toe to toe with her, their hips just inches apart. So what's it going to be? He asked. Formal or informal? Informal, she whispered, her cheeks brightening. I want to be close to you. Ooh, she was good, Ransom thought. Did she even know what those simple words were doing to his heart? Did she know that the way her eyes shined up at him made him want to give her the moon? How could she have done this to him so easily? He reached up and twirled some loose strands of hair at the base of her neck. Informal it is then, Dulcetsa. So you'll stay for drinks this time? Lena asked. I was hoping you'd ask. Felt like ripping apart Velcro. That's how it felt to step away from her in that moment. But he wanted to be careful not to rush things. She still didn't know everything about him, and he was painfully aware of that. The closer they got, the closer he wanted to be to her. But he was hesitant to bring her into his world. Then again, he was too selfish to turn his back on her. Ransom pulled the bottle of champagne out of his bag and walked it to the fridge. Lena was glued to her spot in the middle of the living room even when he got back. He took her by the hand and walked her over to the couch. He sat her down next to him, though she was stiff. Her hand was still like undercooked pasta. What's wrong, Dulcetsa? He wanted to make sure she wanted this. If she was uncomfortable, then he needed to do something about it. You're being so timid. Like a kitten. Lena flashed her eyes up and laughed nervously. I'm just not sure what to do, she admitted. Do you think you could take charge this time? Ransom chuckled. She was so sweet. He scooted closer to her, tracing his finger up her arm. She shuddered and laughed again. What do you want me to do? You said you wanted to be close, he said.
Lena nodded.
How close? He leaned forward so that his shoulder touched hers. This close. Lena shook her head. Closer. Ransom felt a little growl bubble up in his throat. She was a little minx, wasn't she? She knew exactly what she was doing. He smirked and placed his hand on her neck, his thumb brushing lightly over her jawline. This close. She shook her head again, her eyes fixating on his lips. This girl was just as much of a tease as he was, he thought to himself. Not that he was complaining. It was entertaining to hear her breath trembling lightly, to feel her leaning towards him despite restraining herself. Closer, she muttered. Her voice, it was seductive now, whether she meant for it to be or not. He felt his temperature spike at the sound of the one word from her lips. Pulling her gently towards him and inching forward himself, Ransom stopped just shy of her lips. A few more centimeters and he would be there. This, he whispered. Lena closed her eyes and parted her lips, her light breath tickling his lips. CLO. He kissed her. Ransom couldn't take the temptation any longer. He just did it. Lena was surprised at first. Perhaps she thought he wasn't going to do it. But he did. Kissing Lena was like entering a different world. A world made of satin and sunshine, where the air trapped between their locked lips exploded like pop rocks. Ransom's phone rang, and he jerked away like he was being caught doing something he shouldn't be doing. He fished his phone out of his pocket planning just to shut it up, but it was Mariano, one of his capos. Sorry, I gotta take this, he said, standing and walking out of the room. Chapter 31. An untimely disruption. Mariano sat far off as he watched the guys meet poor old Judge William Richter in his own driveway in front of his home. He hated to say it, but the old man had it coming. His beating should have been a lot worse considering how long he'd been dodging paying back his loan. Usually, Ransom would be overseeing a situation like this, but he had assigned Mariano and ran off with an almost giddy smile on his face. It was a little disturbing, actually, considering Ransom tended to be very dark and brooding, but whatever was going on that had him switching up his priorities all of a sudden must have been good. The stern talk Ransom had given the crew a while back popped into his head. That had been about some girl he didn't want them to touch, so perhaps that was it. It was a surprise to think Ransom could have found someone, but Mariano was glad about it. Maybe having a lady in his life would make Ransom more agreeable. He wasn't a mean guy, but he could have a short temper. He could be cold. At 30 years old, it was only right for Ransom to finally find someone worth living for. Mariano didn't want him ending up like Ransom's older brother, or his mother for that matter. But the girl must have been pretty special if Ransom was willing to skip out on a thing like this. It was a tricky situation dealing with Judge Richter. He'd asked to borrow $100,000 from them in order to pay off one of his lawyers who had found out that he'd been slamming his gavel in favor of the Giudice Mafia. Luckily, the lawyer didn't want any trouble, at least, not after the judge offered to pay him out. Unluckily for the judge, he made a promise to pay this lawyer money that he didn't have, money he'd spent on a couple of women he was entertaining. Ransom had allowed Richter to borrow the money to save his SS with the promise to pay half of the price back. He would get to keep his usual $50,000 for helping them out. Meanwhile, they were keeping a close guy on the seedy lawyer. Now a month and a half later, and after a couple of pretty good beatings, the judge had nearly used up all his lives. Richter claimed he didn't have the money, but he was getting paid pretty well by the Giudices, so nobody knew where all of that money was going. Ladies? Gambling? Poor investing. Anyway, he hadn't paid a dime back in ransom and the big boss weren't about to be taken advantage of. This would be the last chance, or he'd be facing a fate much worse than a couple of ball bats to the knees. The soldiers were being a little more playful than they ought to be, Mariano thought. They'd wasted time yelling at the judge, shoving him around, pinning him against the car and humiliating him. They especially enjoyed doing that kind of thing when there were other soldiers around. It made him feel powerful, he figured. But there was a time and place for that, and this wasn't it. "SHT," Mariano muttered when he saw the red and blue lights coming around the corner. He knew those plucky soldiers were having too much fun. They should have been in and out. Those DMN idiots. He sunk down in the seat of the car and watched from a couple of blocks away as all three guys scattered, trying to run away from the scene of the crime. Two of them got shot down with tasers, crumbling to their knees with their teeth in the dirt. One got away because of his athletic ability. He jumped right over the white picket fence into the neighbor's yard. Out of sight, out of mind. That's how it was for the lazy cops in this area. Once little Trenton made it over the fence, they weren't going to go after him. They had two of his buddies down easy right in front of them. There was no need to put in the extra work. Mariano felt like the only reason most of those stars had a badge and a gun was because they wanted discounts on their coffee and donuts. Maybe some of them flashed their badges to catch a pretty girl's eye. Either way, they were overcompensating for something. After watching the two boys get shoved into the backs of a couple of police cars, Mariano figured he'd make the dreaded call to tell Ransom about it. He'd want to get in there ahead of the police and make sure nobody said anything stupid. The boys would likely go to jail for assault and battery, but they'd sworn an oath to never say a thing about the mafia they served. Mariano dialed Ransom, speed dial number one even before his wife. But that was often the way of the mafia. Mariano wondered if maybe that was why Ransom had been so slow in letting his heart get captured. "Lena. Sorry, but I gotta go," Ransom said, standing in the doorway to the living room. Lena was trying not to be offended that he'd broken their kiss and practically ran away from her once he got the phone call. She didn't think he'd take it, but he'd gone to the other room and muttered angrily to someone. Now he was standing in front of her, his face grave and irritated. She stood up from the couch and went over to him, but before she reached him, he had started towards the door. "So suddenly?" she asked, trying to catch up to him in the foyer before he sprinted out of the door. "Sorry, Dulcetsa, I have some business I have to attend to," he said, his face and voice softening a bit. Lena clenched her teeth together. She thought this was going to be the night that things finally clicked for them. They'd finally kissed, and it was so good she could feel it in the curl of her toes. She wanted more. But instead, she was left feeling a bit embarrassed for some reason. She'd started to open herself up to him. She'd asked him to be close to her, and then he immediately ran away. That was tough on a girl's ego. "Okay," she muttered. She walked up to him, hoping her proximity and the sadness in her eyes would be enough to make him stay, or at least make him kiss her again before he left. She reached out for his arm, but instead of reaching out to her, he grabbed the doorknob. "Sorry, I gotta go," he said gruffly, and then he turned swiftly and trotted out the door, down the driveway, and hopped into his truck. Lena was irked. He'd done all of that teasing and then he wasn't even going to follow through? How rude. She went back to the living room and flopped down on the couch. Her foot bumped Ransom's bag of tools. She kicked it further away, picturing kicking him out before he could run out like he'd done. She buried her face in a pillow, hoping for a moment to suffocate on her embarrassment. He hadn't even said a proper goodbye. He was all charming when he got there, and then he'd left like in shoal. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her stupor. It was an instinct to grab it right away, the excited teenage girl in her thinking it was Ransom calling her to apologize. Wait, she didn't have his number. Did he have hers somehow? He had done some kind of background check on her, so it was possible. No. If it was him, she didn't want to answer. She knew it was petty, but she wanted him to suffer a bit after how he'd left. It was so thoughtless. The cold shoulder was a childish game, but she didn't want to go running right back at him after just a mere phone call. She put the phone face down and laid back on the couch, letting the call go to voicemail. She studied the plaster on the walls where Ransom had fixed the holes. She nudged the bag with her toe. He'd be back, she thought. Maybe not right away, but he'd be back. He left his bag after all. And she touched her lips. As far as she was concerned, he had some unfinished business to take. Chapter 32. I hope you're here to apologize. It was only about 10 minutes later when Lena decided to pick up her phone and see who had called her. If it was an explanation about why Ransom had gone in such a hurry, then she wanted to know. She flipped her phone over. There was a voicemail icon at the top, so she called to see what the message was. Good evening. This message is for Lena Morris. I'm Officer Ron Henson. We've brought into custody a man we believe to have been involved in a prior incident that you might have some information about. We would like you to come in for some questioning and to potentially identify this man. Please call us back or come straight to Station 12 Central. What a letdown, Lena thought. Here she got her hopes up that Ransom had called her to apologize, or at least explain where he went, but it was just some cop that she'd rather not have to talk to. She wasn't sure what to do about cops now. Even though she wasn't sure about the particulars of Ransom's job, she knew that he was somehow involved in the mafia. That probably meant she should stay away from cops and police stations if she wanted to protect him. Then again, Lena remembered that Ransom had a cop friend, the detective that brought her home after he'd let her go. They seemed to be on good terms, and Ransom himself had gone into that station, but that was on the east side of town. She wanted to talk to Ransom and find out what she should do. She didn't want to put him in a tight spot. But how was she supposed to get a hold of him? She didn't have his number. She didn't even know his last name. She didn't know where he lived, and even if she did, it didn't seem like the type of area where she should be roaming around by herself. Maybe he would come back after his business, Lena thought. She put the phone down and sat back on the couch. How long did it take to take care of some business? An hour went by then too. Lena answered another call from the police department, and told them she would meet them in the morning. She couldn't just keep avoiding them. That would be even more suspicious. If Ransom came back before the night was through, then she would know how to respond to this situation. If he didn't, then she'd just have to wing it. After waiting up for a total of 5.5 hours, Lena fell asleep on the couch. Why do you look so worn out today? Adrian asked as they laid out their mats. Lena had been pretty restless throughout the night, and apparently it was obvious. Even at work, her boss had asked her if she had a rough evening. She had woken up late and done her makeup in the car. She'd rushed over to the Central District, Station 12, and been interrogated by Officer Henson about another mugging and beating. They suspected the same guys who had beaten up Tommy Berryalias in the parking garage. Apparently, they were able to link the two together because of a shoe print left on both Berryalias and the new guy's hands, and they both were beaten up in the same way. It seemed like pretty weak evidence, but they were looking for these guys for a lot of reasons, and apparently they were desperate to get them on anything. They asked Lena if she'd been able to remember anything else since then, but she told them what she'd had to tell everyone else. She was knocked out. She couldn't remember a thing other than it was two guys. Officer Henson had let her go. And then she'd had a busy day at work full of new expense reports and phone calls for new clients. On top of that, everyone kept asking her why she was late. She was never late to work, and she'd had to lie and avoid answering continuously throughout the day. That was the most exhausting part. And now, even as they were settling into Padmasana, Adrian was whispering to her about why she looked so rough. At that point, she just wanted to go home and get some real rest. Maybe Ransom would be there waiting for her. This is meditation time. Please take this time to be quiet, look inward, and focus on what goals you'd like to accomplish in today's practice, the teacher said. This was her polite way of telling Adrian to shut her trap and stop distracting everyone with her whispering. Lena loved her friend, but she was glad that they were starting class and that she'd finally have some time to rest her eyes and her mind. Maybe it was the exhaustion that helped her. But that class ended up being one of the best she'd ever experienced. Her mind found some peace, and her body felt restored. It didn't last long, however, because as soon as class was over, and they rolled up their mats, Adrian was lingering behind Lena as she was putting her shoes on. Something happened, Adrian said. Lena rolled her eyes. Nothing happened. Yes, it did, Adrian responded knowingly. She slipped on her sandals and held onto the strap of Lena's bag as they walked out of the classroom and to the elevator. I know, because after your breakup, you were all happy and free and eager, and now you're not. Are those bags under your eyes? Lena swatted Adrian's hand off of her. Fine, she muttered. Something kind of happened, but I don't want to talk about it in the middle of an elevator full of strangers. With a scoff, Adrian said. Full of strangers? It's just Cassie from class and that man in the suit. How embarrassing, Lena thought as the door closed them in. Just tell me. God, she was persistent. Fine, Lena said a bit too loudly. We kissed and then he ran away and didn't come back. Adrian's eyes were wide, her hand touching her collarbone in shock. He ran away? He got a call in the middle of our first kiss, and he took it and left immediately. Well, that's rude, Adrian said, using her proper "my friend is offended so I'm offended too" voice. Did he call after at least? Lena shook her head. She did not want to be having this conversation in an elevator, but at least they finally came to the ground floor, and everyone dispersed. Lena got a shy smile from Cassie before she flitted away. Okay, They're gone. Will you at least tell me who this guy is? I mean, he sounded great at first, making you feel all of those feelings, but after that, I'm not convinced. How do you meet him? Adrian asked, pulling Lena to the seating area out in the lobby of the building. I met him while I was taken in for that crime that I witnessed, she admitted, not sure how many details she could get away with telling her friend. So he's a cop? Lena shook her head. He's a criminal? Lena clenched her teeth. Had she already given away too much? It wasn't like Ransom was the guy who beat that man up. But then again, Lena still didn't really know what he did. She played it off, not wanting her friend to be suspicious. Of course not, she said with the wave of her hand. She looked towards the door, hoping to get out of there soon before she accidentally said anything else that she shouldn't. As she scanned the people passing in and out of the door, she noticed a familiar stature through the big glass windows. Ransom? Let's just get coffee before class sometime this week. Okay? Lena said, patting her friend on the arm, still staring out the window. Adrian followed Lena's gaze out of the window. Obviously, you're sidetracked, so get the heck out of here. But you're not about to get away without telling me more about your little friend, you got it. Lena nodded and said goodbye before walking briskly out of the doors of the building. She was excited to see him standing there, clearly waiting for her. But her feelings of embarrassment and disappointment started to rush in as well. Well, I hope you're here to apologize, Lena said, brushing past Ransom. Chapter 33, Back-to-Back Blunders. Wait, Lena, Ransom said, going after her. Don't run off like that. When he grabbed Lena's wrist, she whirled around fiercely and glared at him. Ransom's chest tightened at the sight of her eyes, silently cursing him. He should have known that she would be upset with him. It was harsh of him to leave her like that the other night. He knew that. He just... Oh, so you don't like it when people run off without an explanation? Feels pretty awful, doesn't it? She said snarkily, pulling her hand away from him. Ransom winced. He was in trouble for sure. Better yet, why don't I kiss you and then run away? Maybe then you'd get the full effect. She bit at him.
Lena, I'm sorry.
I really didn't want to leave things like that. Just give me a minute to explain, he said. He'd never felt so weak in his life. He'd barely got started with her before his duties as underboss got in the way. Lena crossed her arms over her chest and looked up at him sternly. Go ahead then. Ransom looked around them. Someone was looking at him suspiciously. He didn't want to draw any attention to them in the middle of this lover's spat. If he even had the right to think of it that way. Let's just get off of this busy sidewalk, he said. He took her hand gently, and she let him, though she didn't tighten her fingers around his hand. They sat down at a little park bench on the other side of the street. As soon as they sat down, Lena withdrew her hand and made a point to scoot a bit further away from him. I know this isn't an excuse, Ransom said, but I haven't done this kind of thing before. I don't really know what the protocol is. Lena stared at him blankly, unamused. I'm sorry I left you like that. I wanted to stay, I really did, but my line of work can be demanding. I should have. You're not supposed to follow up an apology with a but, Lena interrupted. It basically voids it. Start over. She was right. And as inappropriate as it might have been, he was really attracted to her forthright attitude. I'm sorry for leaving you in the middle of that amazing kiss, he said. I shouldn't have taken the call. I get that part, Lena said. I don't expect you to drop everything, Then I shouldn't have left without an explanation. I shouldn't have left so suddenly and so coldly. I was mad about being interrupted in the middle of our kiss and mad that my guys couldn't go a few hours without me, and I took it out on you. That was wrong. I'm so sorry.
Lena sighed.
I forgive you now, but I hope that doesn't happen again. I mean, I needed to ask you something important. Ransom shifted and took Lena's hand again. This time she curled her fingers around his and stroked his knuckles with her thumb. He wanted to kiss her again, to make up for what should have been their perfect first kiss. What was it? He asked. Lena looked nervous again. She was so readable. Her emotions changed so quickly, too. She chewed on her bottom lip. I had to go to the police station again, she said. His blood went cold. Which one? Station 12 in the Central Division. Ransom pulled his hand away and sat up straight. Central Division? They worked closely with the Northeast Division. And last he knew, the Northeast Division had their sights set on taking out the Giudice Mafia. Could they have been working together still? Could they have planted something on Lena, or were using her to get information out of him? He stood up from the bench, his stomach feeling thick and heavy as lead and his ears burning with paranoia. He had to be careful what he told her. He didn't think she would turn against him. But he just needed to be sure before he accidentally said something that ruined him and his family. What did you tell them? Ransom asked, trying to hold back the harshness on his tongue. Lena was looking at him with an angry, pained expression. Her lips were pressed in a firm line, and her hands were clenched tightly in her lap.
No.
I'm not doing this again, she declared. I know you don't have a reason to trust me, but why would I trust you when I don't even know you? He snapped. Lena grabbed up her yoga mat and bag. I just told you last night that I wanted you to know me. I want to be close to you, but you keep running away. I don't expect you to trust me right off the bat, even though I feel like I've already done enough to prove that I'm not after you for any malicious reasons. I like you and I want to get to know you, but if you can't let me any closer, that's on you, not me, she said strongly. Now, I know it's soon, and whatever you've got going on isn't something you can easily let me into, but I'm not asking for that. I just want to know you. So when you figure out if you're willing to get close to me, you know where to find me. But I won't be waiting around forever. Ransom let her storm off. Not that he had the ability to go after her anyway. She had simultaneously put him in his place and told him she liked him all at once. He was shocked, bewildered. All he could do was watch her go back across the street and disappear in the darkness. God, I'm an idiot, he mumbled to himself. He had put his foot in his mouth, and it did not feel or taste good. She had a point though. She hadn't given him any reason to believe that she was after him with malicious intent. She could have easily said something to the police when they took her in the first time, but she didn't. And it didn't appear that she'd said anything about him that morning either. In fact, it sounded like she wanted to tell Ransom about it before she even went in. And all Ransom had done was get defensive and push her away again. He clasped his hands behind his neck and groaned. He was terrible at this already. He had no idea how to date a woman who wasn't already involved with the mafia. He didn't want to drag her into it, but he couldn't deny that he still wanted her. Maybe it was the whole wanting what he couldn't have trope. He didn't know. But he wanted to try. She was obviously willing to try, so maybe it was okay. It wasn't a selfish one-sided ploy if she was feeling it too, right? Well, he had a couple of things to figure out, but he hated that he'd screwed up twice in a row back to back. And after an apology at that, he needed to make things right. That night, Ransom visited with his father about the police trying to track them down again. His father didn't seem too worried about it, though that didn't ease Ransom's mind in the slightest. He called for a meeting with Detective Alvarado, and had him promise to keep him updated about those precincts and their investigations. Having a man on the inside was just as comforting as it was nerve-wracking, but Ransom knew he could count on the detective. He'd proved his loyalty time and time again. Before the night ended, Ransom called in one last favor. With Alvarado's help, he got hooked up with Lena's cell phone number, and sent her a text to apologize and asked to meet up so he could apologize again. It was already late, almost 2 o'clock in the morning, so he didn't want to call her. The next morning, his text was marked as read, but she hadn't responded. Chapter 34. Adrian the Obliviously Wise. Lena draped her purse over the back of the chair at her usual table at the coffee cafe. She slid into the chair and took her phone out to see if there was a text from Adrian, who was running late. She didn't have a message from Adrian, but she did have another one from Ransom. It was the second message he'd sent since their little spat on the park bench 2 days before. She hadn't responded to the first one because she felt like it had come too soon. She was worried that it was just a reflex apology rather than a sincere one. But this second text was a bit different. It read, I want to be close to you too. I'll tell you more about me the next time we meet. I'm ready, just let me know when. She thrummed her fingers along the edge of her phone, itching to answer him and tell her to come over that night. Then suddenly she was getting another call. She recognized it and her stomach flopped nervously, but she answered it. Hello. Lena, this is Officer Henson again. Thank you for coming to the station the other day, but we'd like you to come back once again, he said. Lena gritted her teeth. She didn't get a good feeling from this guy. I'm sorry, but what could this possibly be about? I've already told you everything I know. I know, Officer Henson said. But this time we've got a few pictures we'd like to show you. That's all you have to do. Just look at them, and tell us if any of them look familiar to you. It seemed like a reasonable request, and once again, Lena knew if she refused she ran the risk of seeming suspicious. All right, she responded with a huff. I'm in the middle of something, but I can come after. Is 7:30 okay? That works. Thank you so much for your patience during our investigation, he said before hanging up the phone. Lena flipped her phone face down and leaned back in her chair. Tough day? Dane asked, appearing at the table. She plastered a smile on her face and shook her head. Just annoying spam calls, she said. I get that. So, is Adrian going to be joining you today? He asked, scribbling circles on his notepad. If she is, are you going to ask her out this time? Dane's face fell and his eyes widened. What do you mean? You know what I mean, Lena said, wiggling her eyebrows. Dane smiled and opened his mouth to respond just as Adrian came prancing up to the table. She brushed Dane's arm as she sat down. Dane's face brightened with a pink tint. Sorry I'm lately. Traffic was a bee. Now tell me about this hunky man you're seeing or not seeing, Adrian blurted. Then, putting her arm on Dane's arm, she looked at him and gave her order. The usual, please, Dane. Same, Lena added. Dane nodded, his face getting redder and redder, and went back to the counter to prepare their order. When Lena looked back at Adrian, Adrian had her chin resting in her palm. She batted her eyelashes, eager to hear Lena's explanation. For the next hour, Lena told Adrian as much as she could with as little detail as possible. She told her that Ransom took her to the police station after she'd witnessed the mugging, and he'd stayed with her through the night. She told her that she'd run into him on the street before all of that, and that's when he really caught her eye. She said after she ended things with Brian that Ransom had come to check up on her, and they'd realized their feelings for each other. Adrian ate up every word of the story, and she seemed satisfied with the level of detail Lena had given, at least until it came to the part where he ditched her in the middle of their first kiss. He apologized, but I wonder if he's ready for me, Lena said. I told him the last time we talked that it was his move, and if he wanted to get closer to me, he'd have to trust me a little bit. I'm not totally sure what has him so spooked. Girl, if I were you, I would take charge. I'd pin this hunk down. Tell him how you feel in the plainest way possible. Plant a big ol' kiss on him and tell him how it's going to be if he wants you in his life. Adrian said. You can't be scared when he's also scared or nothing is ever going to change.
Lena Loghead.
I guess you have the answer to both our predicaments, she said, nodding at Dane who was behind the counter taking another customer's order. The interrogation room was always so cold. They sat her in a metal chair at a metal table in an enclosed room with a big one-way glass. Officer Henson opened the door and walked through, but Lena noticed the sleeve of someone standing right outside the doorway. They handed him an envelope. She wondered who it was and if they would be watching this interrogation. Sorry for the delay. We'll make this as quick as possible, Officer Henson said, sitting down at the table across from her. He poured out a few photographs and spread them out across the table. These are all people we suspect to be connected to the Giudice Mafia, and we know they're the ones who've been responsible for some of these beatings, including the one that you witnessed. So please take a close look and tell us if any of these people look familiar to you. There were 6 pictures in total. A couple of them were mugshots, one of which was Manny, the guy who'd kidnapped her that night. The others were grainy candid pictures of men walking down the street or huddled beside a car. There at the end, the second to last picture was a photo of Ransom. It was blurry, obviously taken from far away, but she knew it was him. She was surprised to see his face. She tried to conceal the surprise, but the officer must have noticed the change in her expression. Do any of them seem familiar? He asked. If they do, it's very important that you tell us. I know getting involved with the mafia can be scary, but we've got a lot of resources and people on our side who can protect you. Lena wondered if that was true. Either way, they obviously thought she knew something or they wouldn't have kept bringing her back. She could either continue to play dumb or give them enough information that they would believe she'd been holding onto out of fear, and make them believe she was innocent and afraid. Yeah, she said. I'm just a bit scared. I mean, what if he finds out that I helped you and he comes after me? Officer Henson nodded. He glanced toward the one-way mirror before reaching out and patting her hand. I understand your concerns, but if you can identify this person, then we'll have reason to arrest them and bring them in again. After we connect them to the mafia, then they'll be stuck in jail for a very long time. He won't be able to hurt you. It felt so clear to her that this man was just trying to tell her what she wanted to hear. They wanted her to feel safe enough to release this information. She wasn't sure if she could trust them, but she wanted them to trust her. She scanned the pictures again and pointed to one of them, scooching it across the table out of the lineup. Him. He was there that night. Chapter 35. The Girl in Charge. Ransom was surprised to find that 2.5 days after he'd nearly screwed everything up 2 times in a row, he finally got a response from Lena. It was a simple message, but he had been dragging his feet for those 2.5 days, and this gave him back that pep in his step. Her message read, "Meet me at McCarrick's bar at 10 o'clock. That was just 45 minutes, just long enough for him to get changed and drive over there. He got up from the dinner table where his crew of capos was seated around him for a weekly meeting. Get out of here. I've got plans, he told them. His buddy Brennan jogged after him and stopped him. Where you going, boss? He asked. And what the heck is that look on your face? I'll let you know depending on how it goes. If I manage to screw up again, keeping it a secret will be the only way to save my ego, he responded flatly. Brennan chuckled like he wasn't sure whether or not he should laugh.
Okay, man.
I guess good luck then. Ransom took a quick shower and got dressed. With his hair still a bit damp, he drove to McCarrick's. It wasn't difficult to find Lena. She stuck out like a diamond among coal. Even though she was sitting towards the back of the bar in a booth, Ransom spotted her after taking just a few steps inside of the building. As he passed by the bar, he heard a couple of guys mumbling about a hot dame and flicking their eyes over in her direction. Lena spotted Ransom coming towards her, and a brief smile flashed across her face before she fixed it by chewing her inner cheek and looking down at the table. Ransom slid into the booth, accidentally knocking his knee against Lena's. Sorry, he muttered, excited to see her but feeling embarrassed about the last couple of times they'd seen each other. He really wanted this time to go better. I just wanted to tell you I went back to the police station again today, Lena said. Ransom was not expecting those to be the first words out of her mouth. His heart sank a bit, and a shadow of paranoia loomed over him. He glanced around the bar, looking for anyone who might look cop-like. I didn't go because I wanted to, she was quick to add. They called me in to look at some pictures and try to identify someone. Ransom's leg bounced up and down under the table. He was nervous, but he told himself that no matter what the next few words out of her mouth were, he wasn't going to hold it against her. He waited. I had to point out Manny in a lineup of photos, she said. They saw the surprise on my face, so I had to do it because I couldn't give you away. Ransom was confused. What do you mean? Your picture was in that lineup, Ransom. This wasn't exactly news to Ransom, but it obviously came as a shock to Lena. He bit his tongue and continued to hear her out. I just wanted to let you know that even though you don't trust me, you can. I'm not going to rat you out for any reason, she said, now looking him dead in the eyes. But the longer Ransom looked at her without a response, the less fiercely she looked at him. But, with that said, I also don't expect anything else from you. But if you're thinking of continuing to see me. Lena looked down at her lap and picked nervously at her fingernails. It felt like she was about to tell him to get lost. Did she hate him already? Did he ruin whatever was happening between them so soon? Please just don't hate me yet, Ransom said. Just tell me. Of course I don't hate you. I'm just a little mad, she said, glancing at him. And confused. Both of those nights you. Well, you just can't do that to me. Ransom shook his head. I won't do it again. I swear. Lena leaned forward with her elbows on the table. She put her hands close to his, giving him a spike of hope. Lena wasn't sure exactly what she expected from this. Adrian's words rang in her head, telling her to be upfront about what she wanted, to be brave. It seemed like Ransom was still hoping for her to feel the same way about him. He was lucky she did after the 2 major blunders he'd committed, but now the next step was in her hands. Regarding being new to this, I also don't know the protocol, she admitted, relaxing the tension in her face. I'm not naive enough to jump into whatever this is without knowing more about you. You don't have to tell me everything now, but you can't expect me to just be okay with living in the dark, only seeing half of you. Ransom nodded. I understand. I want to tell you, but I just don't want to put you in any danger. I mean, it would probably be best if you didn't see me anymore at all. Lena shook her head. Don't do that. I don't really care. You should.
Lena huffed.
She knew what she was getting into, but she knew it was crazy. She could count the times she met this man on one hand, and now she was pretty sure about who he was. Well, I don't, she said, brushing his fingers with her pinky. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's the truth. Ransom almost smiled, but he stopped himself. He held her hand and flipped it palm up on the table, tracing the lines of her palm. He looked conflicted, but his little act of intimacy said it all. She really was going to have to take the lead on this one, she thought. I just need to know one thing, she said. What is your last name? Ransom froze, but just for a moment. He leaned back against the seat and fished his wallet out of his pocket. He took out his license and slid it off the table, staring her in the face the whole time. Lena peeked at it. Sure enough, he was a Giudice. Well, at least she knew now. She could know the rest in time when he felt that it was the right time to tell her. Even though she had been running this idea through her mind for a while, Lena was surprised by her bravery. She knew it was insane to want to protect someone she now knew was in the mafia, but she felt like she could trust Ransom. When it was just them, she'd seen a kind of sweet side to him. Okay, Lena said. She slid his license back to him. This was it. That's all I needed to know. Ransom put his ID back in his wallet and hung his head. I guess you know a lot already then?
Lena chuckled.
Apparently words weren't enough for this guy. She leaned over the table and grabbed the collar of Ransom's shirt and pulled him towards her. It was thrilling taking charge. She quite liked it. Lena, Ransom gasped, his eyes wide. She smiled and pulled him the rest of the way, a flutter rising up in her belly. She pressed her lips firmly to his.